Oh no, those are weeks, sorry, not months on the bottom. And again, they argued that the original findings might last more, just because infants tend to protrude their tongue when they're more aroused, when they're happy, when they're getting stimulated. And it didn't matter what the expression was that the actor produced. And then we have this other study by Charles and Barnes, again, adults and participants exposed to the Confederate, again, either rubbing their face like that, or tapping their foot, or shaking their foot, sorry. So I think the Confederate was sitting down in a waiting room. They would have this idea that they were waiting to go into a study, there was another person there, and the other person in the room was an actor who either rubbed their face or shook their foot. There's covert observation going on. And as you can see here, it kind of does support the idea that we mimic, because when the Confederate shook their foot, in the white condition, the participant shook their foot a lot more than when the participant rubbed their face, for instance, and vice versa. So it kind of does support the idea that we have this mimicry of other people's behaviours in these very common situations. However, the authors basically concluded this can't facilitate this contagion process because it becomes way too infrequent. It was like once a minute maybe this happened. And which essentially they argued isn't enough to produce the contagion of emotions. And if we want evidence against the interoceptive bit of the model, we'll have to wait for the next lecture, which is extremely interesting. There's been so much research done into this, but this finally makes me happier. And yeah, we'll go into that in the next lecture. Emotional contagion often gets confused with empathy. So empathy is what I'm guessing most people are familiar with here, or you have your ideas of what empathy is anyway. Empathy, in fact, as a word is very interesting. It was only created about 150 years ago. You might think it sounds Greek, but it was created by a psychologist using Greek terms, essentially. And the idea is that empathy is often confused with both these cognitive and emotional operations, because there's no consensus as to what it actually is. As I said, I'm sure all of you have this idea in your head of what empathy is, but I bet if I ask different people, you probably give quite different definitions. And even psychologists and scientists differ with what they think empathy is. And it's quite one of the main reasons why there's lots of confusion in the field of empathy, because people are using different terms to define it and then studying completely different processes, which is terrible for science. You need to have your terms defined before you start running studies. So Batson, who's a leading empathy researcher, basically said there's 8 different definitions that you can find of what people think empathy is. And it's split into 3 groups. So you have cognitive, which is like very much perspective taking. Empathy involves imagining how one would feel in the same position as the other. Okay, intuitively that might be what some people here are thinking that empathy is. However, the problem with this is that perspective taking will often fail to result in sharing a similar affective state of the target. And other people are defining empathy as when you have to have the same emotion or the same emotional state, affective state, as the other person. So then we have affective definitions. And for instance, the emotion contagion definition. Some people have said emotion contagion is a type of empathy. And essentially it's where exposure to another's emotion causes the receiver to be in a matching affective state. Very simple. Also known as affective sharing or empathic resonance. So for instance, if you're happy, I'm happy. That's empathy. Or if you're sad, I'm sad. However, again, people have said, okay, this can't be empathy, because the perceiver might not know where their emotional state is derived from. Or for instance, I could be happy and you could be happy. But we could both be happy because we're orienting towards the same thing, like our football team is scored a goal, for instance, and we're both following. But it doesn't mean that your emotional response is the cause of mine, it's something entirely different, but we still share an emotional state. So it can't be that. So most people have focused on definitions that use both cognitive and affective features. So the idea is an observer shares the affective state of a target whilst knowing that the target is the source of their affective state, essentially. It has both an affective and a cognitive dimension to where empathy is. And this captures 2 key features of empathy, shared affective states, and there's interpersonal causation, the conscious interpersonal causation, where the other person causes the emotional state. However, when we think about empathy, we actually kind of think what is shared during empathy, and people have looked at this from quite a neural perspective. So Tanya Singer, I think she's at UCL now, in London, but she's one of the leading neuroscientists in the world. And she did this fMRI study, so I don't think I've talked about fMRI yet, maybe I have. It's like an MRI scan, but fMRI is functional, so you get blood flow going to different parts of the brain, and more oxygenated blood. I think I have said this, the more oxygenated blood shows the brain is more active, and you can see which part of the brain has more oxygenated blood and is hence more active. It's a type of brain scan. You get quite colourful scans with this. But basically, the participants were either given these painful electric shocks. So this goes back all the way to the very beginnings of psychology, when we didn't really have much ethics and people just got electrocuted. There's the famous Milgram study, probably the most famous study in psychology, where people electrocute people with 450 volts, which would have killed them multiple times over, simply because the experimenter wearing a lab coat told him to. But we won't go into that now, it's not really my area. Participants were given painful electric shocks, or they received a cue on their screen that indicated that their romantic partners, so they got couples to come in to the experimenting room, and one member of the couple was sitting in one room, the other member of the couple was sitting in the room next door, and one of them was given electric shocks, or they were told that the other member, their romantic partner, was being given electric shocks in the room next door. And clearly they were being given electric shocks, this wasn't just a lie, they were. But this was ethically approved, so it's fine. And basically, you can see this kind of setup. I won't go too much into it. I think it's easy to explain the words with this. But this cue might say that, what is it? Yeah, this cue, for instance, says that, this one says that you're going to receive an electric shock with either low or high intensity, and this one says that your romantic partner is going to receive an electric shock with either low or high intensity. Essentially, that's what the cues are for. And then you waited a few seconds, and then the person did receive the electric shock. And then you went on to the next trial. So bold activity. Bold means blood oxygen level, I can't remember what the details for, but it's blood oxygen level, so the activity. In the ACC, we talked about the ACC earlier, it's kind of like an emotion centre in the brain, or at least an affective centre, and the insula, which is next to the ACC. Both of these are classic emotion areas in the brain. And they found that activity when participants experience pain and when their romantic partner experience pain were completely correlated. So I think you can see it here. Yeah, when someone was experiencing pain, which is in green, it activated the ACC, which is this part of the brain. This is a sagittal slice of the brain, than when the other person was. And you can see it in the insula, you can see it in the ACC, okay, you can see it here. So the idea was that we experience the same brain activation when we're experiencing pain as when someone else experiences pain we care about. And this was viewed as kind of like the neural quality of empathy. It's really a shared affective state, even though we're not experiencing the pain ourselves. However, the problem is, because the task had no requirement for emotional identification, as I said, it appears to suggest there's this congruence between neural activity associated with empathy and pain. However, there are problems with the study and the interpretations that people have had. So the main one is called the reverse inference fallacy. Okay, this is, if you do any neuroscience, this is the big thing you want to avoid. And people make this mistake so often. Basically, the idea is that if you have this overlap in neural activity, if there's neural activity in the same place that different people show, it doesn't mean that they're experiencing the same cognitive processes, the same emotional processes, whatever, whatsoever. But it's very easy to make that conclusion. If you say, I'm experiencing activity in this brain area and someone else is, we must be experiencing the same thing. It's a logical fallacy. For instance, we have this study by Danziger et al. And they have participants with congenital pain sensitivity. So some people have this. It's very, very rare, but you're unable to feel pain. And you might think that sounds good, but it's actually terrible because pain is extremely useful as like an adaptive mechanism that makes us like, okay, if I'm touching something that's extremely hot, it's painful, so I'm going to move away from it. It's very adaptive for survival. But there's these people with congenital pain insensitivity and health controls. And they observe pictures of the realm. Essentially, they're meant to induce emotions by observing pictures of pain and expressions. And what they found was the controls and the people with congenital pain insensitivity experience activation in exactly the same areas, even though, so for instance, you would either see someone in an extremely painful situation. I don't know what that is. I think it's someone with like, is that like a garden? Yeah, it's like a garden instrument, like what do you call it? Garden scissors, like cutting off their finger, or someone being in an extremely painful situation. And they found that these people experienced activation in exactly the same areas, even though one group can't experience pain, so they can't be in the same affective state. They can't really be experiencing empathy as such, because they don't experience pain themselves and they don't know what it's like. And essentially, the match responses of these people with pain sensitivity can't be attributed to empathy because they don't experience pain. So basically they argue that even though they're showing the same activation, you can't say that they're experiencing empathy, and instead it's possibly just like arousal that's being measured in these fMRI scans, or the general emotional significance of the stimuli. But even then, so we've got emotion contagion. In fact, shall we have a break now? Yeah, we can have a 5-minute break. So basically the idea is we don't want to commit the reverse inference fallacy, but also that kind of ends the emotion contagion empathy bit. So the final main process that has been put forward to explain how one person's emotion affects other people's is called orientation calibration, and they're two, complex words in some ways. It was created by Parkinson. So Brian Parkinson, that's Brian. He's the head of my lab in Oxford. He's at Christ Church, which is the college there. Very beautiful. I'd recommend visiting if you get the chance. And basically, he comes up with this theory called orientation calibration only a few years ago. It's really interesting to talk to him about it, actually. And this is the different way that one person's emotions affect another person's emotions. And it's very much low level. So this is what happens when we interact with one another. But we end up having calibrated or coordinated orientations towards objects which coordinate our emotions without us really even realizing what's happening. So there's no inferences involved, it's not cognitive, and there's no appraisals involved. But basically the idea is that low-level processes operate reciprocally. There's always this permanent bidirectional basically, what's the word? Processes, or basically we become aligned with one another when we act. So our body language, our facial expressions kind of almost, not intuitively, automatically become aligned with one another. And it's kind of similar to the imitation research I was talking about earlier. But because they become aligned with each other, we then end up sharing similar emotions without needing like the interoception thing that Hatfield was arguing about. We share the same appraisals or orientations towards objects based on our behaviours aligning with one another. I probably haven't explained it very well, but hopefully some examples will. So the idea is that this is the diagram in his article, but you can have things like body movements and directed gaze, which then affect the gaze of another person, which then affects the gaze of the first person, and then back again, and the same body movements. And the idea is that as we interact with one another, it's a very continuous, ongoing process. But our body movements and gaze gradually become aligned with one another, essentially, over this series of reciprocal, bidirectional influences. So these are some examples of orientation calibration. We might orient to an object in the environment. So it could be, say, a cute puppy or something. And then, because we're oriented towards the cute puppy, we cue the gaze of the other person towards the puppy. And then we end up having this calibrated gaze. We're both looking at the same thing, which then puts our emotions, which then basically orients our emotions in a similar way, because we're looking at the same thing. Or we can have the same thing about stances. So I might be approaching or looking like I'm approaching something, which means that the second person approaches that object, and then we have these shared approach movements, shared avoidance movements. The same thing, you can talk about intensity of movements. If someone's moving around like really actively, really high energy, really high intensity, then maybe we're gonna reproduce similar actions ourselves. It's kind of similar to that Schachter and Singer study I mentioned in the last lecture, where they had this adrenaline, and people copied the actions of the other person. So you have all of these different things that happen when we interact with people that then affect the other person, and it's very reciprocal and bidirectional, but it leads to like these shared effects. So it's really elegant, and if you read his papers, in fact Brian, he writes better than anyone I've ever known in terms of like the beauty of his writing and how he puts how he puts his theories across. So I'd recommend reading that paper. It's extremely interesting. But these things haven't really been studied before. They're very difficult to study. But yeah, intuitively, I think we kind of think that they are there. As I said, if I'm oriented towards something, then it's going to cue the other person's gaze, that type of thing, and stances, things like that, gaze, stances, kind of minor non-verbal stuff. But most previous research, as we've already said, has used these stimuli that deliberately produce emotional meaning by like encouraging reverse engineering. So, for instance, what would be a good example? In the visual cliff experiment, for instance, there's a cliff there which is ambiguous, and therefore it's producing the emotional response in the mum, either like fear or smile, because the stimulus is inherently quite like effective and produces these responses. So most previous researchers use stimuli that deliberately produce this emotional meaning, but in orientation calibration, these effects are more likely to be found when we're using less explicitly emotional stimuli, because then it takes out the influence of emotion contagion and social appraisal, for instance. So we have to have these situations where people are interacting with one another, but without necessarily there being an emotional stimulus in the environment. And how do we evaluate orientation calibration? So there's been this really interesting study on gaze and how gaze becomes calibrated. And basically, the bottom line was that participants more accurately detected gaze direction from these schematics, so diagrams, drawings of eyes, taken from fear expressions relative to these neutral or disgusted eyes. But this was the case even when the eyes were inverted, when they were upside down. And the conclusion that they made from this was that gaze can be tracked accurately from widened eyes with more visible sclera. So the sclera is the whites of the eyes. So we have the iris in the middle of our eyes, and then the sclera is the whites. Humans, I think, are the only species with whites in their eyes. So the idea is people have studied the sclera, especially anthropologists and like evolutionary biologists have studied the sclera quite intensively, because we're thinking, okay, why do we have this feature that no other animal has? Even monkeys, I don't think, have whites in their eyes. And the idea is it's this adaptive mechanism which is used to help us track the behavior of other people, because we're more social, more interactive than other species. We are the social species as humans. Something like the sclera has evolved to help us track eye gaze and hence facilitate these things like orientation calibration. So you'll see a diagram of this on the next page. So I guess the point that I really need to emphasize is that yes, people detected gaze direction fear, but it wasn't because it was showing fear itself. It was because it happened even when it was inverted, which you don't recognize inverted eyes as showing any emotions. But it happened because the whites of the eyes were wider. So you can see here, these are the stimuli that they used. And they had, for instance, disgust eyes and fear eyes. So which is the right way up? I can't remember now. But basically the idea is that they had fear eyes and disgust eyes, and when we're disgusted, our eyes kind of narrow, and the sclera becomes less visible, essentially. Whereas when we're scared, the sclera becomes more visible. And you can see here from this diagram that gaze orientation was increased in the fear eyes, when people saw the fear eyes and when they saw the disgusted eyes, and this was quite significant. And yet it was inverted the other way, like the wrong direction, with disgust eyes and fear eyes when they made these judgments. But essentially, yeah, these eyes with more whites, we found it more easy to track their gaze in this task, where we had to say which way it was looking, essentially. But this is quite a complicated task, because you see the fixation cross, and then you see these eyes, and you have to say which way were the eyes looking. The eyes are only presented for a split second, 300 milliseconds, and then you have to say which way is it looking. You don't get any motion cues, you only get the diagram. So it's quite a tricky task, and people were much better at working out which way the eyes were looking when there were more whites to the eyes. You can see here, this is another example of it. And also their response time was quicker too. So the iris area, which is obviously the inverse of the sclera area, was correlated with slower responses. Have I gone through that too quickly? Does anyone want me to explain that again? It's quite, yeah. This diagram. Okay, so forget about vertical aperture.
But the idea is that we have an iris which is black, the sclera which is white, and it's evolved to be white because it contrasts best with the sclera. And because of that, we can see the eye moving within the eyeball, the iris moving within the eyeball. And so it's more easy to see which way someone's looking. The iris and the sclera obviously are kind of inversely proportional to one another. So if the iris is bigger, we have less whites for the eyes, and vice versa. And this diagram here, the dependent variable along the bottom, along the x-axis, is iris area. So for instance, you'd expect if the iris is bigger, if the black of the eye is bigger, then our judgments about which way the eye is oriented, you can see here, become slower. So this is response time, but it's actually inverted. They've done something to it. So the bigger the iris area, the slower people are to respond, because it becomes less obvious which way the eye is looking. Does that make sense? So the idea is that we have what Brian is saying, and he's using this literature from anthropology and evolutionary biology, is that we've evolved these mechanisms that basically help us to pick up on these very subtle non-verbal cues, such as eye gaze, to basically calibrate our orientations in some way. We find it easier to track, and hence we're more likely to, if we can track people's gaze really well because of this adaptation, then we're more likely to share the same orientations towards things because we're oriented towards the same objects. And then we have this thing called interpersonal entrainment. This is also an interesting concept. So essentially it's when people synchronize their rhythm or tempo of their movements. And how have people studied this? So this study by Reddish about 10 years ago used dancing to do it. And dancing is really good to use for something like interpersonal entrainment because, I mean, I'm a terrible dancer, but even despite that, I might be able to get my movements within some sort of synchrony with someone else, which is, I guess, something that we kind of unconsciously strive towards if we're dancing with someone. So how did they do this study? They used like a silent disco style. Has anyone been in a silent disco here? They're really good fun. I'd recommend. So if you don't know what it is, you have the headphones on, you listen to the music on, you choose the stream, and then you're dancing to it, but there's no actual music coming through speakers in the room. So basically what they did was they played music to participants' headphones, and the two people were dancing together, but the beat was either congruent or incongruent, right? So if it's congruent, people are far more likely to be entrained rhythmically because the rhythm is entraining their dance moves. We dance along to a rhythm. If it's incongruent, then their movements are less congruent, they're less well-oriented together, they're less entrained. And basically, the idea was that when they danced in a synchronous way, because the beats in their headphones were congruent with one another, they consolidated these rhythms of attention and movement. I can't remember exactly how they measured attention now, but essentially their movements were a lot more coordinated. And then this produced these pro-social tendencies in like subsequent games. So the public goods games down here, these are things we use in psychology, especially social psychology a lot. It's kind of like the investment game, the prisoner's dilemma. Do you guys know what the prisoner's dilemma is? Yeah? And the investment game is kind of when, or the trust game is another word for it. Someone starts off with a certain amount of money or points, and you choose to invest a certain amount in another person, your partner, and then it matures. So I think that person gets 3 times the amount you gave them, and then they choose how much to give back to you, essentially. So people can make, and basically it's testing fairness. So someone can, if you give something to someone and then they get 3 times what you gave them, and then they get the opportunity to give it back to you, they should be giving back to you if they're fair, like roughly half and half amount. But you can test this. Some people are more fair, some people are less fair than others. And essentially the idea was that when people danced together in a synchronous way, they were more cooperative in these subsequent public goods games. They were more likely to cooperate, they were more likely to invest, give back a fair return, that type of thing. Yeah, you can see it here. This is the donation in the trust game. So it was a trust game. And you can see that when they were synchronized together here, they gave back far more points and money to their dance partner than when they were asynchronized or when there was no synchrony. When it was passive, they didn't even receive any music whatsoever. And another bit of support for orientation calibration comes from group contexts. So why are groups important? basically, when we're in a social group, we're always, well, not always, but frequently engaged in these activities that have shared purpose or shared meaning for all of the different members. But we're also dependent on other people within the group for like these group goals to be realised. And so we have these things called Zeitgebers. It comes from German. I don't know if anyone here speaks German. I don't actually know exactly what the literal translation is. But essentially Zeitgebers, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. It could be completely wrong. But they're cues from the environment that basically entrain rhythm. So things like marching. When an army formation is marching, they're getting cues from, say, the marching band, from the sergeant who's directing them, that provide like a common focus. And so, for instance, Smith has theorized that group members recognize that their colleagues' actions match their own signals. So, for instance, if we're marching, we're receiving information from our bodies. Obviously, like we know. I know right now where my hand is there and that I've got my fingers outstretched. But I'm receiving proprioceptive information that's coming into the brain. But as we're marching, we may recognize visually that the people around us are producing the same movements as us. We may consciously recognize that. I think that's quite obvious, really. And then the idea is, this is kind of fluffy, but the idea is that this encourages us to form like this socially oriented self, which is almost dependent or associated with everyone else around us who is producing the same actions, which then in turn facilitates this emotional transfer within groups because we're associating ourselves with other people. And has there been research support for this? There has. So it's best shown via these naturalistic studies of people actually interacting, songs and dances, especially songs and dances, because the idea is, why do we have music when other species don't? Why do we enjoy music? And people have theorized, again, kind of fluffy, we can't really test these things because it's all evolutionary. We can't do experiments on it. It's millions of years old. But the idea is that songs, dances may have evolved to facilitate emotion sharing because, as I said, it entrains people doing the same activity together, listening to the same thing, synchronizing themselves together. But the idea is that these group members may register their common orientation towards these meaningful symbols and then calibrate their appraisals accordingly. So how have we studied this? So this study by Slater in 2018 used the England national football team and various others. So this was a dreadful team. It's from Euro 2016. We lost to Iceland. We have a population of 300,000. It was tragic. But from this tournament, they got participants to rate the passion of the different nations as they sung their national anthem before Euro 2016 fixtures. And England players never sing the anthem passionately at all. It's always just droning on about God save the Queen or King now, I guess. And most of them aren't even, they're barely literate, so they can't really even put the words together. But they rated the passion of the different nations as they sang their national anthems before their football fixtures in this major international tournament. And what they found was, again, it's a limited sample size. Maybe if they'd done this over multiple international tournaments, I might. So take these conclusions with a pinch of salt. But they found that the national anthem is rated as being sang more passionately, led to them conceding fewer goals and winning the knockout games. Everyone knows exceptions to this. I remember Brazil in 2014 sang the most passionate national anthem I've ever heard, and they lost 7-1 to Germany. But you can see the graph here, that in the knockout stage, the more passionate they were at singing their national anthem, they had an increased log likelihood of winning their match. As I said, take it with a pinch of salt, but it has been used in psychology textbooks. And the idea is that team members appraise each other's emotional commitment and purpose during the singing rituals. They're like, yes, we're really invested, we're involved, we're going to win, get pumped up. And the level of passion aligns this emotional orientation, conveys a sense of unity, and the idea is it improves performance in the game. Take it with a pinch of salt, but that's one study. And here's another study. This will be relevant to all of you guys as students, and myself, obviously, of course, having done undergrad or taught courses. So they had students in an exam, or at least they were about to take an exam. And they induced anger in some participants by informing them that their exam marking was going to be really strict to combat grade inflation. So you can imagine, last year everyone's been getting A's, B's, A stars, that type of stuff. And then this year they're like, right, we're going to stop that. You're not going to get good grades. We're going to massively push down everyone's grades because of grade inflation. you're probably going to be quite angry if the person you know in the year above you has got an A, and if you do the equivalent work, you get a C. So they induced anger in this way. Surefire way to get students angry, really. And then after that, they provided them with feedback about the reactions of other students in their class. This was all made up, but obviously they manipulated it so that some people's reactions were like also angry, some people were sad, resigned, some people like the nerds were probably like, yes, this is a good idea. And the idea was that they then asked people to select other people for like a subsequent task. I can't remember what the task was. There was some sort of game. Or maybe it was, no, I think it was related to the exam thing. It was like a task writing to the, no, I can't remember what it was now, so I'm not going to say. But there was a task that they had to do. And essentially the angry participants, the people who were really, really fed up that their grades were going to get reduced, were more likely to select their angry counterparts than sad counterparts for their team in their subsequent tasks. So they wanted to pick people who shared the same emotional orientation as them in this task, which again provides support for this emotional calibration account and social appraisal, because we're more likely to orient towards people who share our emotions, and the emotion is leading that. So you can see here, let me see, how do I interpret this graph? Yeah, if own anger is high, then team member selection. Sorry, I just need to get my head around this graph. Maybe it's best just to skip this graph, but the idea is they were more likely to choose someone for their team if they were angry than if they were sad, the shared emotion. But even though sadness is like a negative emotion, they both had negative views towards what had happened. But it wasn't just the result of attitude similarity, because as I said, other people who were equally disapproving, the people who were sad but not angry, weren't selected as often. So it can't be a result of attitude similarity. It has to be the emotions that are determining self-categorization and who you choose in the subsequent task, even in the absence of like these existing self-categories that people have known from out knowing their classmates for years and years. So again, what does this show? It shows, first of all, social appraisal. We're taking in information from other people which is in some way affecting our own orientations. And second of all, it's orientation calibration, that we choose people who have similar orientations towards us. So these things can combine as well. Just as we can have social appraisal, we can have just as we can have social appraisal and emotion orientation calibration. Sorry, we can also have emotion contagion and orientation calibration. They kind of sometimes interact within a situation. So yeah, these emotions define social boundaries. They define social categories, which then facilitates further calibration of orientations because you see them as part of the same group. I hope that makes sense. If anyone has any questions, I might have gone through parts of that quite quickly, and there's probably things you're all thinking about now about what I've said, so please do ask any questions if you have them, and I hope I haven't gone through it too fast. Oh. Okay, great. So I think you've all got a lecture in here next, but I guess you can take a break or something. And these are some of the suggested readings. I still need to send you these PowerPoints, but I'll get them to you, and you can see these readings. Yeah.
The orientation towards the same
Yeah.
Isn't that like a reverse inference fallacy in the sense that you're looking at the same thing, but you're experiencing the same emotion isn't common? And what we talk about in reverse inference fallacy.
That's a really good point, though. I like that, that's a good point. The difference I would say is that with the brain activity, well, there's a couple of differences. The first one is with brain activity. We don't really know how the brain works, and different brain areas have different functions. So the same brain area can be involved in various different functions, right? Various different activities. And so it's difficult to say with any certainty that if you're sharing brain activity, you're experiencing the same thing. Obviously, you might say, oh, if you're looking at the same thing, you might not be experiencing the same emotions about it. But the idea is, even if you're not, you're far more likely to be sharing the same emotion than if one person's looking at one thing and the other person's looking at something else.
Does that make sense? That if there's a cute puppy on the floor, like someone, the first person looking at it might really like the puppy, the second person might hate puppies, but the idea is because they're looking at the same thing, it's far more likely that they will share the same appraisals towards it than if he's just looking at something completely different. I hope that's an adequate explanation. Any more questions?
I was just wondering, is like similarity of emotional orientation predict like dating choices and why people partners are
I don't know any research into it, but I would imagine so. As I said,
If our orientations are calibrated, then it's extremely pro-social. It's extremely pro-social. Like as I said, people invested more in themselves. They're more likely to spend time with other people. If your orientations are calibrated in that way, then it feels good. It's very pro-social. It leads to positive social outcomes. So I can imagine it does have a correlation with things like friendships and dating and things like that. I don't know how you test that. You'd have to get people to interact in like speed dating and then see which ones had successful relationships and wanted to see each other again and which ones didn't. But yeah, that's actually a really good idea for a study. Yeah.
Because like the one we saw with the child, if the mother was smiling or showing a face of fear, it was affecting the child's decision. And then we saw in the one with the farmer where they were familiar with this person. So if that, like, if my mother, for example, saw me in pain, she would also like probably feel really bad about something. But if it's some other person, they really don't care. Like, okay, she's in pain, I might help her, but that's it.
yeah, that's a really good point. The reason why those researchers use romantic partners is because like you're far more likely to get these empathy effects. You don't see empathy with everyone. If you see someone that you hate
and they have some misfortune, like they fall over, you're not going to feel empathy for you. You're probably like, we have Schadenfreude, right? The German word for feeling pleasure at someone else's pain. So yeah, it massively does depend on whether you like the person or not, right? I should have probably put some slides in about that, to be fair. But yeah, this is the thing. When we interact, regardless of whether it's something to do with emotions, something like that, we have all these different interacting sources of information that are judging our response to it, and that can be the situation, of course, whether what's happened to the person, have they just been electrocuted, but also, you're right, our dispositional knowledge or how we perceive the other person, what we know about them, whether we like them, that type of thing. They're all interacting with one another. So yeah, you're right. We don't experience empathy in many occasions because if there's someone you really don't like, you're probably going to be happy, not sad that something's bad happened to them, or you're going to feel sad or angry if they do well. For instance, everyone knows that everyone's experienced that before, right? So yeah, that's a really, really good point. That all of this research has been done where they're trying to encourage these processes. There's no point studying empathy and getting two people who hate each other.
Sometimes the feeling that these characters have, they just don't want to our emotions about them, and still we feel like some sort of empathy. So it is, even though the characters, sometimes what she said, if the character has a very villainous character, so even though they're going through a painful situation, they may not feel like, oh, that person deserves something.
Yeah. So are you saying like it depends on how much you like the character or not? As in, are you saying that in films we might like someone but not feel the empathy they're going through something difficult?
Yeah, like if how they portray this way also very important. How they represent in the movie, how their character is represented. If they're like villainized doing something harmful to other people, but at the end of the movie, usually there will be some tragedy happening with these villains characters.
Yeah.
So then we feel, oh, that's what we need to see in the story. So that makes our day so.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's as I said, it's like Schadenfreude, where if there's a baddie and they beat their comeuppance at the end, then yeah, we're not going to feel much empathy for them, are we? So again, you're right. The plot narrative has dictated that.
So there is like a good or bad character that is instilled into you, and then you see like if I want to be empathetic with somebody, then I should see some sort of a good in that person.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's right. As I said, that's exactly why these researchers first of all use the mum and the child, and second of all use the romantic partners, because these are people who are more likely to, for instance, the baby is more likely to use the social cues from the mother rather than some random stranger, for instance,
because they have this shared emotional connection and bond, and same with the romantic partners.